The trigger is cold. I know this because my finger has been resting on it for 11 minutes. I counted. When you are 16 years old and you are lying in rubble with a rifle that belonged to a man who no longer needs it, you count things. You count the seconds between shell bursts. You count the men left in your section. You count the days since you last ate something that was not boiled leather and snow. You do not count your heartbeats, because if you start doing that, you will realize they are going too fast, and then you will remember that you are afraid. And fear is the one thing that will kill you faster than a Soviet bullet. My name is Lajos Fekete. I am 16 years old, or I was, before this city swallowed me whole. I volunteered. That is the word they use. As though anyone in Budapest, in the autumn of 1944, had a choice about anything at all. Below me, in the gray canyon of what used to be Vasi Street, something moves. I press my eye to the scope and breathe out. It is not a Soviet soldier. It is an old woman in a black coat, bent double under the weight of a bundle, crossing the open street with the desperate speed of someone who knows exactly what open streets mean now. She makes it. She disappears into a doorway, and I release a breath I have been holding for a very long time. I have been here for 41 days. This is what I remember of being alive. Before those 41 days, the smell of my mother's kitchen on a Sunday morning, paprika and onion fat, the way the light came through the lace curtains and made patterns on the wooden floor, my father's voice reading the newspaper aloud, not because anyone was listening, but because silence made him uneasy, our dog Bela asleep under the table, an ordinary life, an entirely ordinary Hungarian life, the kind that was supposed to go on forever. Wars always happen somewhere else, until they don't. My father disappeared in March of 1944, when the Germans entered Budapest. Not disappeared the way soldiers disappear. Disappeared the way the wrong kind of people disappeared that spring. He was a school teacher. He had books in the house that the wrong people decided were dangerous books. One morning, 2 men in leather coats knocked on the door, and he went with them quietly, and we never heard from him again. I was 15. I became the man of the house, which meant I was a boy pretending to be a man, in a house that was slowly falling apart. My mother worked at the textile factory until the factory was bombed. My sister Erzsébet was 8 years old, and she had nightmares every night. I would sit on the edge of her bed and tell her stories until she stopped shaking. Stories about brave knights and magical horses. Hungarian stories, old stories, the ones my grandmother used to tell. Because those stories had survived 1,000 years of war and occupation, and I believed, with the desperate logic of a 15-year-old, that they would survive this too. In October of 1944, the Arrow Cross took power. I will not explain to you what that meant, because if you are listening to this, you already know. I will tell you only what it meant for me personally. It meant that the notices went up on the walls. Every male between the ages of 16 and 50, report for duty. It meant that one afternoon, I came home to find my mother sitting at the kitchen table, hands folded in front of her, and an Arrow Cross officer standing in the doorway. "Your son," the officer said. "How old is he?" 15, my mother said, without looking up. "He looks 16, the officer said. There was a silence that lasted 1,000 years. "He will be 16 in January, my mother said. The officer wrote something in his notebook. "We will be back in January," he said. My mother did not speak for the rest of that evening. She made soup from a bone she had been saving. She ladled it into my bowl first, then Erzsébet's, and then she sat down and did not eat hers. I watched her, and I understood, in the way that children always understand things before they can find words for them, that she was making calculations, that she was measuring the weight of the future against the weight of the present, and finding both of them crushing. 3 days later, I volunteered. I did it because I thought, if I go now, on my own terms. I can choose something. And I did it because I thought, God help me. I was 15 years old, and I thought this. I thought that maybe, if I went and fought, if I proved something, they would leave my mother and sister alone. I thought that was how it worked. I was 15 years old, and I thought there were rules. The uniform did not fit. The tunic was made for a man 6 inches taller than me, and the boots had been worn by at least 2 soldiers before they reached my feet. I stuffed the toes with newspaper. When the sergeant looked at me, he did not say anything for a long time. "Can you shoot?" he finally said. "Yes," I said. I had fired my uncle's hunting rifle once at a tin can, and I had not missed. "Can you follow orders?" "Yes." He handed me a rifle, a cartridge belt, and a tin plate. That was all. There was no ceremony, no speech, no moment of sacred national purpose. There was a sergeant with tired eyes, handing a child a weapon, and that was the entirety of my induction into the defense of Budapest. My unit was what they called a mixed formation, a kind word for a collection of people who did not belong anywhere else. There was Horvath, who was 43 and had a bad knee. There was Balazs, 18, who had been a student at the Technical University before the university was bombed, and who still carried a mathematics textbook in his pack because he said the weight reminded him of who he was. And there was Father Martin, who was not supposed to be there at all. He was a priest, 60 years old, but he had refused to leave the city. He carried only his Bible and a medical kit he had put together himself from whatever he could find. He looked at me on that first day and said, "How old are you, son?" 16, I said. It was still 2 months away from being true. He said nothing. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder, and then he turned away. And that was the only acknowledgement any of us ever made of the fact that I was a child, standing in a man's war. Budapest, in December 1944, was like looking at a photograph of a city through shattered glass. The bridges were intact, barely. The great bridges across the Danube that had always seemed like permanent features of the earth, as fixed and eternal as the hills themselves. The Chain Bridge and the Margaret Bridge, standing in the winter fog above the Black River. They would not stand much longer. I did not know this yet. The streets were emptied of normal life, but full of war life. The strange, feverish busyness of a city being destroyed. Soldiers moving in columns, carts piled with furniture that someone still believed was worth saving. A pair of women carrying a wardrobe between them, down the middle of a deserted boulevard, moving with the careful determination of people performing an act of pure denial. I was assigned to hold a section of the outer defense line on the pest side, the flat side, the commercial side, the side that the Soviets would take first. Our orders were simple in language and impossible in practice. Hold your position. Do not retreat without orders. Conserve ammunition. Conserve ammunition. As though we had any. Horvath translated this for me. It means we are here to slow them down. It does not mean anyone expects us to stop them. Then what are we doing? I asked. We are buying time, he said. He paused. I am not certain for what. I wrote a letter to my mother that evening, by the light of a single candle stub. I told her I was well. I told her the food was good. I told her I was with good men, and that Budapest would hold, and that this would all be over soon, and I would be home for Christmas. Every word was a lie, and I knew it, and I wrote them anyway, because the alternative was to write the truth, and the truth would not have helped anyone. I signed it. Your loving son, Lajos. Do not worry. I am not afraid. I was afraid. I was so afraid that at night I lay in my coat on the stone floor and focused all of my concentration on breathing slowly and steadily, in and out. 4 seconds in and 4 seconds out, because if I breathed that way, the fear could not get a foothold, and I could get through 1 more hour, and then another, and then another. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. This is how you survive. The unsurvivable. One breath at a time. The first time I fired my rifle in combat, I did not know what I had hit. It was a gray morning in December. The Soviets had pushed up through a block of apartment buildings to our east. We could hear them, the sounds of soldiers moving through a building, the creak of floors, the opening of doors, and then suddenly they were at the end of our street. There were shouts. Sabo fired first. I raised my rifle and aimed at the mass of movement at the far end of the street, not at a person, at movement. That was what the sergeant had said, and I pressed the trigger. The recoil hit my shoulder, and the sound was enormous in the canyon of buildings. I worked the bolt and fired again and again, and then there was a whistle from Horvath, and we fell back, running in a crouch, and I ran, and the world was very simple and very loud, and I did not feel anything except the need to move. Later, in the silence, I sat against a cold stone wall and looked at my hands. They were not shaking. That surprised me. I had expected them to shake. Balazs sat down next to me. He offered me something from a tin. I took it without looking at it. It was cold and had the texture of fat, and I ate it. "First time?" he asked. I nodded. "It doesn't feel like anything," he said. "That's what I found, the first time. You expect to feel something enormous, and instead it just feels like nothing." "Yes," I said. "That changes," he said. And then he went back to eating and said nothing more. And I understood from the way he said it that he was not offering comfort. He was offering information. That night I dreamed of Bela, our dog. He was sitting by the kitchen door, waiting to be let in, the way he always did, patient and faithful and confident that the door would eventually open. In the dream I kept trying to get to the door, but the kitchen kept getting longer and longer, and I never reached it. I woke up to the sound of artillery, and lay there in the dark, and missed my dog, with an intensity that felt almost physical, like a wound. There are things I saw in Budapest that I have never spoken about. I am speaking about them now. I will not describe everything. Some things, once described, cannot be undescribed. But I will tell you what I saw one evening in January, because if I do not tell someone, then the only people who will remember it are the people who did it, and they should not be the only witnesses. I was moving alone between positions, carrying a message, and I came to the embankment of the Danube. There were Arrow Cross men there, Hungarian fascists, our own people. There were civilians there too, men, women. An old man in a hat that seemed absurdly formal for what was happening. Their hands were bound. I pressed myself back into the shadow of a doorway. I was 20 meters away. I will not describe what happened. I will tell you only that I stood there in that doorway, and I did not move, and I did not cry out, and I did not raise my rifle, and I have lived with that, with the frozen stillness of those minutes, every day since. I was 16 years old, and I was alone, and there were 12 Arrow Cross men, and I had 4 cartridges left in my rifle. And I have spent many years telling myself that these facts make the mathematics clear, that there was nothing I could do. I don't know if I believe that. The Danube was very cold that night. The ice had come in from the edges, and the river moved slowly between the ice shelves, dark and heavy and indifferent. The great chain bridge stood upstream in the fog. Somewhere across the water, Soviet guns were resting in the brief silence before the next barrage. I walked away from the embankment. I have walked away from that embankment in my dreams every night since. In January, the horses began to die in the streets. The horses were the last working animals in the city. They had pulled the artillery, the supply wagons, the ambulances, and when the food ran out for them, as it had run out for us, they simply lay down in the streets where they were and stopped. And in those days of hunger, the soldiers came out at night with whatever cutting tools they had. because there was nothing else. Balazs had his mathematics textbook. At night, when things were quiet, he would take it out and read it by whatever light there was. Not studying it, just reading it, the way you might read a letter from someone you love. As though the presence of those equations, those clean and logical relationships between abstract things, was a reminder that there existed a version of the world in which problems had solutions. "What are you reading?" I asked him one night. "Differential equations," he said. "Does it help?" I asked. He thought about this. "It reminds me that things can be understood," he said. "That's all. It reminds me that things can be understood." Then came the order. The officer was perhaps 22. He wore his uniform with the stiff precision of a man who believed the uniform was the most important thing about him. His name was Varga. "There is a man in the cellar of the building on the corner," Varga said. "He was found trying to leave through the Soviet lines." "He is a deserter," Varga said. "He's a civilian," I said. I said it quietly. I was not trying to argue. I simply needed someone to acknowledge the fact. "He was carrying information," Varga said. "He was going to the enemy." I looked at him. I tried to read his face for something, doubt or conflict or anything human, and found nothing. He had simplified himself entirely. That was the most frightening thing about him. He had made himself simple. He put a pistol on the table between us. I looked at the pistol. "He's somebody's father," I said. I don't know why I said that. It was true, probably. It seemed important. Varga said nothing. "I'll go down," I said. "I'll go down and see him." I took the pistol, because if I didn't take it, Varga would send someone else. And I did not yet know what I was going to do, but I knew that I needed to be the one to do it, whatever it was. He was sitting against the far wall, with his wrists tied in front of him. He was wearing a good coat, the kind a professional man wears. He was perhaps 65. He had white hair and round glasses, and in the light of my match, he looked at me with the expression of a man who has made his peace. That expression almost broke me. "Are you going to shoot me?" he asked. Very calm. "The way you ask whether it will rain." "I don't know," I said. It was the most honest thing I had said in 40 days. He studied me. "How old are you?" 16, I said. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, he said, "What is your name?" "Lajos." "Lajos," he said, as though he were tasting it. "My grandson's name is Lajos. He's 12. A pause. "He's in Debrecen, I think, with his mother." Another pause, longer. "I hope so." I sat down on the floor across from him. My knees gave out, is the truth. A sudden exhaustion so complete that standing was no longer a reasonable option. We sat there in the cold and the dark, and he told me his name was Dr. Jeza Vasarheli. He had been a cardiologist before the war. He was trying to reach the Soviet lines, not with information as Varga claimed, but with his medical bag, because he had heard that there was a field hospital across the lines that needed surgeons, and he was a doctor, and that was what he was. He said this without any heat or self-justification, as though it were merely a logistical matter. "Do you believe me?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "What will you do?" he asked. I looked at the pistol in my hands. I had been holding it the whole time, without knowing I was holding it. The metal was cold. Everything in this city was cold. "I'm going to go back upstairs," I said. "I'm going to tell the officer that the prisoner is dead. I'm going to fire this pistol into the wall." He looked at me for a long time. "And then?" he said. "And then," I said, "I'm going to come back down here and untie your hands, and you're going to wait until after dark, and then you're going to leave through the hole in the east wall that we use when the snipers are active. And then whatever happens to you after that is between you and God." "And what happens to you?" he asked. I thought about this. "I don't know," I said. "Lajos," he said, "you should know that whatever happens, Whatever you have done or not done in this city, you are not what this city is. You understand me? You are not what is happening here. I went upstairs. I told Varga the prisoner was dead. I pressed the pistol against the cellar wall and fired once. Varga nodded and said nothing and walked away, and I stood in the corridor for a long time afterwards, leaning against the wall, breathing. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. I went back down and untied the doctor's hands. He gripped both of my hands in his. His grip was very strong for an old man. "Lajos," he said. "Go," I said. "It's going to be dark in an hour." He went. I don't know if he made it. I will never know. But he went. And that is the one thing in Budapest that I am entirely certain was right. And I hold it carefully, the way you hold something fragile and irreplaceable, a ceramic bowl or an egg, or the last memory of an ordinary Sunday morning, with paprika and onion fat and lace curtains, and a dog asleep under the table. The bridges fell on January 18th. I was 300 meters from the Danube when it happened. The shockwave rolled through the frozen streets and knocked Horvath off his feet, and brought down a section of wall we had been using as cover. And the sound was not like anything I can compare to another sound. It was more like the earth deciding to speak, briefly, in a language made of force, rather than words. The Germans blew the bridges to slow the Soviet advance on the Pest side. We stood in the street, those of us still standing, and looked at the smoke rising from where the chain bridge had been. Father Martin was next to me. He crossed himself, then he crossed himself again, as though once was not sufficient for a loss of that magnitude. "I was married on that bridge," Horvath said. He said it without particular emotion, the way you might report a weather condition. We looked at the smoke for a long time. 2 days later, Pest fell. We crossed over to Buda on the ice. There was no other way. The ice of the Danube in January is perhaps 30 centimeters thick, and it groaned under the weight of an army in retreat. And we crossed in the gray dawn, with shells falling into the water around us, and the ice shaking with each impact. And the sound the ice made was like the sound of something alive that does not want to break, but is being asked to bear too much. Balázs lost his mathematics textbook crossing the ice. It fell from his pack when he slipped, and the current took it. He stopped at the edge of the ice and watched it disappear downstream, and his face did something complicated that I will not try to describe. And then he got up and kept walking. Some things you cannot save. This is the central lesson of a siege. Buda, Castle Hill, the last fortress, the old city on the hill above the river, with its medieval walls and Baroque palaces, and the great dome of the royal palace. All of it now reduced to something between a military position and a cemetery. We moved through the tunnels, the old castle tunnels built centuries ago for exactly this kind of last resort. And above us, the city was being unmade, stone by stone, as methodically as it had once been made. There were perhaps 30,000 of us left, soldiers, gendarmes, Arrow Cross men, German SS, Hungarian regulars, the old and the young, and the men who had been wounded and had nowhere else to go. We were surrounded, not as a metaphor, not as a strategic assessment. We were physically, completely surrounded by Soviet forces on all sides, and the only question remaining was not whether, but how long, and at what cost. In the tunnels, Father Martin heard confessions, continuously, for days, in a small alcove in the tunnel wall, by the light of a single candle, and the line of men waiting never seemed to get shorter. I waited in that line. When my turn came, I sat down across from Father Martin, and I said, "I let a man go." "Tell me," he said. I told him everything. The cellar, the doctor, the pistol fired into the wall. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what the cost might be if this is discovered?" "Yes," I said. And you would do it again? I thought about this honestly. Yes, I said. I would do it again. Then there is nothing for me to forgive, he said. God does not require forgiveness for acts of grace. He blessed me. I sat in the alcove for a while after he moved to the next man, not praying exactly, but sitting with something that felt adjacent to peace. And in Budapest, in February of 1945, something adjacent to peace was more than most people had. I will tell you what hunger feels like, the real kind, the kind that goes on for weeks. It starts as an annoyance. Then it becomes a presence, a constant companion, insistent and demanding, that you cannot ignore. Then, after about 2 weeks of genuine starvation, it does something strange. It becomes almost peaceful. Your body stops expecting food, and so stops screaming for it. And instead there is a kind of lightheadedness that is not unpleasant if you don't think too hard about why it's happening. Your hands shake. Your vision at the edges goes soft and unreliable. Sounds become very precise in the center and muffled at the edges. Small things take on great significance. The weight of your rifle, the temperature of the stone floor, the pattern of cracks in a wall. You notice these things with a clarity that would seem hallucinatory, except that it is entirely consistent. Sabo gave me half of something one night, a heel of bread he had been keeping inside his coat, against his body, to keep it from freezing solid. I do not know where he got it, or what he had traded for it, and I did not ask, because there are economies in a siege that you are better off not examining too closely. I ate it in the dark, very slowly, making it last, and it tasted like nothing so much as being alive. Just that, the plain, unremarkable, tremendous fact of being alive. Horvath died on February 7th, not from a bullet, from his bad knee, which had developed an infection that spread. He died in the tunnel, quietly, at 3 in the morning, and we knew he was gone, because his breathing simply stopped. One of us had been listening to it, without meaning to, for hours. That was how you knew. The absence of a sound you had not known you were attending to. We wrapped him in his coat. There was nowhere to bury him. We left him against the wall, with his hands folded. And Father Martin said whatever words Father Martin said, and we went back to our positions. The order came on February 11th. Breakout attempt. The word breakout had been spoken for weeks in the tunnels, with the weight of a religious term, with the particular reverence that people reserve for things they need to believe in more than they can justify believing in. The plan was to break through the Soviet encirclement, move northwest, reach the German lines. The German lines were 30 kilometers away. Through the February winter, and the complete and total armed might of the Soviet forces surrounding Budapest. But there is something in human beings that resists the logic of mathematics when the mathematics lead to death. And so we assembled in the tunnel, and we checked our weapons, and we looked at each other, and nobody said what everyone knew. But hope is also an act of will. In the end, all hope is an act of will. Balázs stood next to me. He had lost perhaps 30 pounds, and his face had the hollowed quality that faces get when the person inside them is running out of resources. But he was there. He was upright. Differential equations, I said. He looked at me. Does it help? I said. The question I had asked him weeks ago. He thought about it. Then, very quietly, he laughed. A real laugh. Brief and genuine and out of place in every possible way. Not really, he said. No, not at all. We laughed for about 4 seconds. Then the signal came, and we moved. I will tell you the truth about the breakout, since the truth is all I have left. It was not heroic. It was men running through the snow in the dark, while flares turned everything white-green, and machine guns traversed methodically across the open ground, and people fell. And the ones who hadn't fallen yet kept running, because stopping was not an option. because there was no position to fall back to, because behind us was a city that had already fallen, and ahead of us was the only direction left. I ran. I fell twice, once in a shell crater, once over a body I didn't see in the dark. The second time I fell, I lay there for a moment, and the ground was very cold, and the noise was very large, and there was a part of me that simply did not want to get up, that had reached the place beyond exhaustion, where the cold ground seems almost comfortable, where the logic of continuing seems less obvious than it once did. Then I thought of Erzsébet, 8 years old, nightmares every night, stories about knights and magical horses. I got up. I do not know where Balázs fell. I know that at one point he was next to me, and then he was not, and I did not stop to find out what had happened, because stopping was death. And I kept running, and his absence was something I put in the same part of my mind where I had put everything else: the embankment, the cellar, the horses, the bridges, the part that was getting very full and very heavy. Sabo made it. I know this because he was next to me when we crossed the line, or what we believed was the line, the uncertain boundary between the encirclement and the open road, and we lay in a ditch together and breathed, and we lay there for a long time, looking up at a sky that was clearing very slowly, revealing stars. Of the 30,000 who attempted the breakout, perhaps 700 made it to German lines. I did not know this number for many years. When I learned it, I had to sit down, and I sat down for a long time. Budapest fell on February 13th, 1945. I was not there to see it fall. I was in a German field hospital, 40 kilometers to the northwest, with a fragment of shrapnel in my left shoulder that had been there for 3 days. A German doctor removed it, with tools that were old and instruments that were cold, and no anesthetic except a piece of wood to bite down on. The war continued for 3 more months. Germany surrendered on May 8th, 1945. I was in Austria. I began walking east. I walked for 11 days. The roads were full of people walking, soldiers and civilians and displaced persons and survivors of things that do not have adequate names in any language, all of them moving in the direction they hoped was home. I walked into Budapest on a morning in late May when the linden trees were in bloom. The city was devastated, not the word-sized version of devastated, but the real thing. Blocks and blocks of buildings reduced to their foundations. Rubble that had once been streets and shops and apartment buildings and schools and hospitals, and all the small, elaborate infrastructure of a functioning human civilization. The bridges were gone. The river ran free between its banks, without the punctuation of the spans. And that absence was stranger and sadder than anything else. The absence of something so familiar that you had stopped seeing it, and now its absence was all there was to see. I found the apartment building on the 3rd day, or what remained of it. The building was partially standing. The upper floors were gone, but the lower floors were intact. And as I stood in the street outside, a woman came out of the building next door and looked at me. For a long moment, I did not recognize her at first. She was thinner than I remembered. There was gray in her hair that had not been there. "Lajos," she said. "My mother." Erzsébet was behind her in the doorway, taller than I remembered, 9 years old now, nearly 10. She looked at me with her enormous eyes, and then she came running, and she hit me so hard when she reached me that I stumbled, and I held on to her, and the shrapnel wound in my shoulder hurt enormously, and I didn't care. "You came back," Erzsébet said, into my coat. Muffled, matter of fact, as children are. "I came back," I said. My father had not come back. This was something we all knew, and none of us said. There are spaces in families that are shaped like people who are not there, and you learn, eventually, to live around those spaces, not ignoring them, not filling them, but learning the geometry of a life that has a permanent absence in the middle of it. Bela the dog was also gone. Erzsébet told me he had died in November. She said it plainly, the way she said everything, as though things that had happened were simply things that had happened, and what mattered now was what came next. She was 9 years old, and she had already learned this, which says something about 9-year-olds in cities under siege that I find simultaneously heartbreaking and magnificent. In the weeks after my return, I began to understand something that no one had prepared me for, because there is no way to prepare for it. The weight of returning. The war gives you a set of skills and a set of experiences and a set of permanent alterations to the way your nervous system processes the world. And then it ends, and you are supposed to put down the skills and the experiences and go back to being whatever you were before. And you try. You try because there is no alternative but trying. But the weight of what you carried doesn't leave you. It redistributes itself into the ordinary objects of your ordinary life, and it stays there, and you learn to live with it, the way you learn to live with a bad leg or a missing finger. Not by forgetting it, but by building a life large enough to contain it. I thought about Dr. Vazarhely, the cardiologist. I thought about him often. I never learned whether he made it. In 1952, when I was working as a laborer in the reconstruction of the city, I was helping to clear rubble from a block in the 5th district, when we found, in the basement of a bombed building, a leather medical bag. It was old, and the leather was cracked, and the clasp had rusted shut. I have no logical reason to believe it was his. There is no evidence that it was. A city under siege must have been full of medical bags, but I sat with it for a long time, in the rubble. This old cracked leather bag. And I thought, maybe, just that, maybe I left it where it was. It seemed wrong to move it. Erzsébet became a doctor. I tell you this not because it is surprising, but because it seems important. Because in the arithmetic of what was lost and what survived, her becoming a doctor is a number that matters. She was 9 years old, and she had nightmares. And I told her stories about knights and horses, and she became a cardiologist. I have never been entirely sure whether this was coincidence or something else. She lives in the same city. She has 3 children. They do not have nightmares, as far as I know. She has never asked me very much about Budapest, and I have never told her very much about it. Not because I want to hide it from her, but because there are things that belong to the person who experienced them, and not to the people who love that person. Sometimes, when I visit her, she will look at me in a certain way, with that same steadiness she had as a 9-year-old, those same enormous eyes, and I understand that she knows more than she asks about, that she has always known more than she asked, that she is her mother's daughter, and her mother was a woman who knew exactly how to hold things that were too large to speak. I am telling you this from a distance of many years. I am telling you this because I think the distance is necessary, not to soften what happened, but to see it clearly. Up close, things are too large to see. You need to step back until the whole shape is visible. Here is what I know now, that I did not know when I was 16 years old and lying in rubble with someone else's rifle. I know that courage is not the absence of fear, but something that exists alongside it and does not cancel it. I know that being afraid and continuing is not the same as not being afraid, and that the second is not superior to the first. I know that there are moral choices that have no good options, that sometimes you are given a pistol and a set of stairs leading down to a choice that will mark you for life either way, and that what you do with that pistol is not a test with a correct answer. It is simply a revelation of who you are at that moment under those conditions. I know that small acts of grace are not small. A doctor released into the dark, a piece of bread shared, a laugh in a tunnel before a doomed breakout. They are structural. They hold things up. I know that surviving does not mean winning. I know that returning is not the same as coming home, and that coming home is not the same as being safe, and that being safe is not the same as being healed. And I know that the stars do not know what has happened below them. They burn indifferently. They have no opinion on what human beings do to each other in the darkness beneath them. This used to feel like an accusation. Now it feels like a mercy. Budapest is a beautiful city. I want to say this clearly because it would be easy to hear everything I have told you and think of it as a city of rubble and fear and frozen rivers and cruelties. And it was all of that, but it is still a city of linden trees in spring, and the great Danube between its rebuilt bridges, and the light on the hill above the water in the early morning, when the fog comes off the river, and the city appears in it like something rising out of the past, which is exactly what it is. They rebuilt the chain bridge. It took 5 years. When they opened it again, I stood on it for a long time, longer than made sense, probably. And I stood there, and I thought about Horvath, who had been married on that bridge, and who had died of an infected knee in a tunnel in January, and about Balázs, whose face I can still see precisely when I close my eyes, and about Dr. Vasarhelyi, who may or may not have made it through the hole in the east wall, and about the people I saw on the embankment that January night, and about all the things I carried across the ice and out of the city, and back again in May, when the linden trees were blooming. I stood on that bridge, and the river moved beneath me, and the city made its city sounds around me. I was 23 years old. I had seen enough for 10 lifetimes. I was improbably alive. I breathed in, I breathed out, 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out.